The Wild West. We imagine cowboys with revolvers, dusty saloons, poker games, and sheriffs keeping order in lawless towns. But for women, this world was nothing like the movies. It was unforgiving, brutal, and often terrifying. Imagine living in a place where the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away, where you were judged not for your character but for your usefulness to men, and where every day was a gamble between survival and ruin. For women in the Wild West, life was not about adventure, it was about endurance. Tonight, we'll strip away the myths and dive into the hidden struggles that women faced, the isolation, the danger, the violence, and the impossible choices that defined their existence. So, what you're about to hear will forever change the way you think about the Wild West, the harsh reality behind the myth. The story of the Wild West has been polished by dime novels and Hollywood movies. In those tales, women are often the lively saloon girls, the supportive ranch wives, or the brave schoolteachers taming the frontier. But peel back the myth, and you'll see something very different. Most women were trapped by the sheer imbalance of frontier life. In mining camps, men outnumbered women 10 to 1. This meant women were considered valuable, not as individuals, but as commodities. A wife was seen as a tool for survival, someone to cook, haul water, chop firewood, tend to livestock, patch clothes, raise children, and somehow endure it all without complaint. Imagine the endless grind. Fetching water wasn't as simple as turning on a faucet. It could mean hauling heavy buckets from a well in freezing weather, several times a day. Washing clothes was done by hand, bent over a tub, scrubbing with lye soap until your skin cracked. And food, if you were lucky you might grow a garden, but drought, locusts, or hailstorms could wipe out your entire supply in an afternoon. And yet, these were the respectable lives. Women who had no family connections, or who found themselves alone, had even fewer choices. In many towns, the only work available was in saloons or brothels. To the outside world, saloon girls appeared glamorous, bright dresses, lively music, constant attention from men, but behind the scenes, it was brutal, poor wages, constant harassment, and the looming shadow of disease. A single slip could mean sickness or death. Even for women who married wealthy ranchers or businessmen, safety was never guaranteed. Epidemics of smallpox, cholera, and tuberculosis swept through frontier towns. Childbirth was often fatal, with women dying from infections that could have been prevented with the simplest medical knowledge that was often days, if not weeks, away. Isolation on the frontier. One of the most brutal challenges women faced in the Wild West wasn't violence, or even poverty. It was isolation. Picture this. A woman living on a homestead, miles away from the nearest town. Her nearest neighbor might be 10 miles down a dirt trail. Letters from family back east could take months to arrive, and travel was dangerous. For many women, loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a constant, gnawing weight that could drive people to despair. Imagine being trapped in a small, drafty cabin with a husband who left at dawn to tend cattle or mine silver, and you, left behind, were expected to keep everything alive: children, crops, animals, and sometimes even the husband's sanity when he came home defeated. There were no social gatherings, no easy companionship, and little help in emergencies. If a child fell ill or a storm blew the roof off, there was no cavalry coming to save you. You dealt with it or you didn't. The isolation was made worse by the danger. Native raids, wild animals, or even lawless men could show up without warning. Many women slept with a rifle by the bed, ready to defend themselves if their husbands weren't home. Diaries from frontier women often speak of the eerie silence of the plains. Silence broken only by the howl of coyotes at night, or the cry of a baby that couldn't be comforted. Mental health wasn't a concept back then, but depression, anxiety, and what they called hysteria were common. Some women simply broke under the strain, while others steeled themselves into stone. Either way, isolation shaped them into survivors, but at a terrible cost. The constant fear of violence. The West was never as lawless as the movies suggest, but it was far from safe. For women, danger lurked everywhere. Bandits, drifters, and desperate men roamed freely. In many frontier towns, there were no reliable sheriffs or marshals. If someone attacked a woman, justice was unlikely. Even within the so-called safety of a home, domestic abuse was rampant and largely ignored by society. A woman had no legal recourse against her husband, and if she tried to leave, she risked starvation, destitution, or being shunned by the community. Violence wasn't only from men. Life itself was violent. Childbirth often meant facing death head-on with no pain relief, no sterile equipment, and no trained doctor. Many women wrote letters knowing they might not survive labor, A small cut from a kitchen knife or a burn from a stove could lead to infection, and infections were often a death sentence. And then there was sexual violence, a subject few dared to speak about openly, but which shaped the reality of countless women. Lone women traveling by wagon risked assault. Women working in saloons were treated as property. Even respectable wives were not free from the expectation that their bodies existed for their husbands' needs. Violence was the unspoken law of the land, one that women had no choice but to endure. Childbirth and the burden of motherhood. Motherhood in the Wild West was not a tender story. It was a brutal gamble. Women were expected to bear many children, partly for survival. High child mortality meant families often had 6, 7, even 10 children, hoping a few would live to adulthood. But every birth was a risk. Without access to doctors, women relied on midwives, neighbors, or sometimes no one at all. The statistics were grim. 1 in 5 women could die during childbirth or from complications shortly after. Fever, hemorrhaging, and infections claimed lives routinely. Babies were no safer. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, or whooping cough swept through households, sometimes wiping out multiple children in a single season. The emotional toll was immense. Women grieved silently, burying babies in unmarked graves on their land. They were expected to move on quickly, to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Mourning wasn't practical when survival demanded labor, and yet, motherhood was seen as the defining role of a woman. To fail at it, to be barren, to lose too many children brought shame. Some women bore this weight their entire lives, carrying scars of both the body and the soul. Women of the saloons and brothels. If being a farm wife was grueling, life in the saloons and brothels was equally brutal, but in a different way. For many women, working as a saloon girl or prostitute wasn't a choice. It was survival. Poverty, abandonment, or widowhood left few options. In a mining town full of men, demand was endless, and saloon owners grew rich while women risked their lives nightly. Saloon girls were expected to flirt, dance, and encourage men to drink, but they were also vulnerable to harassment, assault, and exploitation. Brothels, meanwhile, varied from high-class establishments with some protections to dingy, disease-ridden shacks, where women were treated as disposable. Syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, and without effective medicine, these diseases destroyed bodies and lives. Some women turned to alcohol or opium just to endure, and when they aged or became ill, many were discarded, left to die in poverty, forgotten by the men who once paid for them. Yet, despite the misery, some women carved out influence in this world. Madame Rune brothels sometimes offered better treatment than the streets, and saloon women could wield social power in towns where few women lived. But make no mistake, for most, this was a brutal existence, one step away from ruin. Pioneer wives and endless labor. On the other end of the spectrum were the pioneer wives, women who built homesteads alongside their husbands. While these women were often celebrated for their strength, their daily grind was almost inhuman. A pioneer wife worked from before sunrise until long after sunset. She tended livestock, churned butter, made soap, spun wool, sewed clothes, hauled water, chopped firewood, planted and harvested crops, cooked every meal from scratch, and still had to raise children. There were no days off. Sickness didn't stop the chores. Winter storms didn't stop the chores. Even pregnancy and childbirth didn't stop the chores. The diet was meager: bread, beans, salted pork, and occasionally wild game. Malnutrition was common. Women were often thinner, weaker, and plagued with chronic ailments from overwork and poor nutrition, and yet these women were often the backbone of their family's survival. Without their labor, homesteads would fail. The irony was clear. Their strength kept the frontier alive, but their suffering was rarely recorded, their names rarely remembered. The rare women of power. It wasn't all misery. A handful of women found ways to rise above the brutality and carve their own destinies in the West. Figures like Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley became legends. Women who stepped into roles usually reserved for men. Businesswomen, too, thrived in some boomtowns, running boarding houses, shops, or even saloons. Widows sometimes inherited land and proved more capable at running ranches than their husbands ever were. But these cases were rare. The women who defied tradition were often ridiculed, ostracized, or romanticized only after their deaths. They were exceptions, not the rule. For every Annie Oakley, there were thousands of nameless women struggling in silence. Still, these rare figures remind us that women in the Wild West weren't merely victims, they were survivors, fighters, and in some cases, pioneers of their own kind. Mail order brides and the price of desperation. One of the strangest, and often saddest, realities of the Wild West was the phenomenon of the mail-order bride. The frontier was overwhelmingly male. Mining towns, cattle camps, and outposts were filled with men desperate for wives. Women were scarce, so scarce that entire businesses formed around connecting civilized women back east, or even from Europe and Asia, with lonely bachelors in the West. For the women who answered these ads, the promise was usually better than the reality. They dreamed of escape from poverty, abusive families, or grim prospects back home. A photograph and a few letters convinced them to risk everything, traveling thousands of miles to marry a man they had never met. The reality was harsh. Some men were kind, but others were violent, controlling, or deceitful. The woman had no safety net. Once she arrived, she was bound to him by law and custom. Escaping meant being stranded in a hostile land with no money, no family, and no protection. Yet, many women endured it, believing that even a hard life in the West was better than the life they left behind. Some managed to carve out real marriages and stable homes. Others simply endured misery in silence. The idea of the mail-order bride reveals just how desperate both men and women were. In a place where survival was never guaranteed, even marriage was a gamble, one that often cost women far more than men. The burden of disease and poor medicine, illness was another constant enemy, and for women, it was often deadlier than for men. The West was rife with diseases: cholera, smallpox, influenza, diphtheria. Outbreaks could sweep through a settlement and kill dozens in a week. Women, often caring for sick children and neighbors, were at the front lines of these epidemics. Medicine was primitive. Doctors, if they existed at all, relied on bleeding, mercury, or opium. Quacks traveled from town to town selling miracle cures that often did more harm than good. For women, the risks were amplified. Pregnancy and childbirth were leading causes of death, but so were infections from minor cuts, untreated tuberculosis, and sexually transmitted diseases. Brothel workers, in particular, bore the brunt of syphilis, which slowly destroyed the body and mind. Herbal remedies passed down from older women sometimes worked better than professional doctors. Midwives and granny women used roots, teas, and poultices to fight fevers or ease labor pains. But these remedies had limits. For many women, the knowledge that illness could strike at any time created a shadow over daily life. They worked, they endured, but always with the grim awareness that tomorrow could bring a cough that never went away, a fever that burned too hot, or a pregnancy that ended in a shallow grave. The harsh reality of widowhood in the Wild West. Widowhood was not an exception, it was an expectation. Men died young. Farming accidents, mining explosions, gunfights, disease, and simple overwork meant many women were widowed in their 20s or 30s. For a woman, the death of a husband didn't just bring grief, it often meant instant poverty. Land ownership was tied to men. A widow might inherit nothing or be pressured to remarry quickly, so another man could claim her husband's property. If she had children, the burden was crushing. Many widows had to take in washing, work in boarding houses, or even turn to prostitution just to feed their families. And yet, some widows became symbols of resilience. They managed farms on their own, ran businesses, or even defended their property with a rifle in hand. Frontier newspapers sometimes told stories of widowed women who fought off bandits or tamed wild land. But for most, widowhood was a brutal reminder that survival in the West was fragile. Love and marriage might bring companionship, but death was never far behind, and women bore the consequences most severely. Immigrant women and double hardship. The Wild West wasn't just built by American settlers, it was shaped by waves of immigrants. But for immigrant women, the hardships were doubled. Chinese women often arrived under contracts that left them trapped in servitude, whether as laborers, cooks, or prostitutes in Chinatowns across the West. Racism meant they were rarely accepted in white communities, and laws often restricted their ability to marry or own property. Mexican and indigenous women faced another form of hardship: displacement. Their lands were seized, their cultures suppressed, and their marriages to Anglo men often marked by power imbalance rather than partnership. Even European immigrant women, Irish, German, Scandinavian, struggled to adapt. Language barriers, prejudice, and the demands of labor left many isolated. Some found solidarity in immigrant communities, where old traditions survived in pockets of the frontier. But overall, immigrant women lived under constant pressure: work harder, prove loyalty, endure prejudice, and survive with even fewer protections than white women born in America. The myth versus the reality of the Wild West woman. The image of the frontier woman has been polished into legend. strong, stoic, determined, a figure of rugged independence. But the reality was far darker. The myths of the noble pioneer wife, the fearless cowgirl, the saloon queen, were often crafted by men or romanticized by later generations. They erased the suffering, the hunger, the abuse, and the endless toil. They turned nameless women into symbols, stripping away their humanity. The reality was that most women did not live glamorous lives. They lived with dirt floors, crude tools, scarce food, and constant danger. Their strength wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Their bravery wasn't celebrated, it was demanded. This myth-making still influences how we think of the Wild West today. But behind every myth was a woman whose life was brutal, unrecorded, and often forgotten. Childbirth, the most dangerous battle. If there was one ordeal that defined the brutality of life for women in the Wild West, it was childbirth. Modern medicine had not yet reached the frontier, and hospitals were virtually non-existent outside of a few larger cities. Women gave birth in cabins, tents, or dugouts, often attended only by another woman, a mother, sister, or neighbor. Midwives existed, but they were not always nearby when labor began. The risks were staggering. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Complications like breech births, hemorrhaging, or infections could strike suddenly, and there were no doctors skilled enough to intervene. Even if a doctor was present, his treatments, forceps used incorrectly, or the liberal use of chloroform, could be as dangerous as the problem itself. And then there was the silent killer, puerperal fever, caused by unsanitary conditions. This infection spread quickly after childbirth. Many mothers would survive the pain of labor, only to die days later in fever and agony. The emotional toll was just as crushing. A mother who survived often faced the heartbreak of losing her baby. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Diseases, malnutrition, or simply the harsh environment claimed countless newborns before their first year. For many women, childbirth was less a celebration of life and more a gamble with death. Each pregnancy carried with it the knowledge that it might be the last thing they ever did. Violence in the home. The Wild West was a violent place, and that violence often followed women into their own homes. Domestic abuse was common, but it was rarely acknowledged publicly. The law was stacked against women, with most states considering wives to be the property of their husbands. If a man beat his wife, authorities often looked the other way, claiming it was a family matter. For women trapped in isolated cabins, there was little chance of escape. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain, and even if granted, it carried enormous stigma. A divorced woman could be cast out of her community and left without financial support. Some women fought back, defending themselves with fists, knives, or even firearms. A handful of sensational cases made headlines. Women accused of killing abusive husbands. Sometimes juries acquitted them out of sympathy, but just as often, they were punished harshly. The culture of silence around domestic violence meant many women endured in secret, covering bruises, hiding scars, and putting on a brave face for their neighbors. For them, the frontier was not a land of freedom but a prison where even home offered no safety. Education and the fight for literacy. For women in the Wild West, education was both a rare privilege and a hard-won battle. Many frontier towns had no schools at all. Where they existed, children often had to walk miles just to reach them, braving snow, heat, or even threats from wild animals. Families struggling to survive sometimes pulled their daughters out of school early, insisting their labor was needed more at home than in a classroom. And yet, women recognized the power of literacy. Knowing how to read and write opened doors. It meant access to letters from loved ones, the ability to keep household accounts, and even the chance to teach others. In many settlements, women themselves became the first teachers, running one-room schoolhouses that served every child in the community. For young girls, the schoolhouse was often the only space where they could dream beyond survival. They read stories, memorized poetry, and learned arithmetic, hoping one day for a life less harsh than their mothers. But those dreams often faded quickly as they were married off in their teens, or forced into relentless labor. Still, the fact that so many frontier women insisted on literacy for themselves and their children was a quiet act of rebellion. It was their way of carving a sliver of hope out of a world that seemed determined to deny it. The isolation of the frontier woman. If hunger, violence, and disease didn't break a woman, loneliness often did. Many women spent months at a time with no one to talk to except their husbands and children. Homesteads were miles apart, and harsh weather made travel nearly impossible. Letters from family back east could take weeks or months to arrive. This isolation bred depression. Some women sank into despair so deep it was called prairie madness, a condition described in letters and diaries. Women would grow restless, anxious, and sometimes violent, unable to cope with the endless silence of the plains. To combat this, women found creative ways to connect. Quilting bees, church gatherings, and barn dances became lifelines, rare chances to socialize and share burdens. Even these events, however, were infrequent, and often required dangerous journeys across hostile landscapes. The isolation of the frontier shaped women into figures of resilience, but it also left deep scars on their mental health. For every story of bravery, there were untold stories of breakdowns, suicides, and lives lost to despair. Women of color on the frontier. The narrative of the Wild West often centers on white settlers, but women of color endured some of the harshest struggles of all. Indigenous women were caught between two worlds, their own cultures and the relentless advance of settlers. Many were forced into marriages with white men, sometimes willingly for survival, other times under coercion. Their children often faced rejection from both communities. Entire nations of women were displaced, their traditional roles stripped away by reservation life and government policies. African American women, whether freed slaves or children of freedmen, carved out lives in Western towns, but racism followed them relentlessly. Many were relegated to roles as laundresses, cooks, or maids. Others joined black farming communities, where they endured not only the hardships of the land, but also violent attacks from hostile neighbors who resented their presence. Mexican women who had once owned land under Spanish or Mexican rule suddenly found themselves dispossessed after U.S. expansion. Marriages too. Anglo men often placed them in subordinate roles, their culture and language suppressed in favor of English and American traditions. These women lived with a constant awareness that their struggles were magnified by prejudice. They were pioneers, survivors, and builders, but history often wrote them out of the story entirely. Marriage on the frontier, a risky bargain. Marriage was often less about love and more about survival in the Wild West. For women, it could be the difference between protection and destitution, but it was never without risks. Many young women married in their mid-teens, some as early as 14. Parents often encouraged this, believing a husband's presence offered security in a world that seemed designed to devour the weak. But once married, women were expected to surrender nearly all rights. Their husband legally controlled property, wages, and even their children. Life inside marriage could be cruelly pragmatic. A husband might view his wife as labor, someone to raise crops, bear children, and manage the home. Widows remarried quickly not because of romance, but because survival demanded it. Some women became the second or third wife of a man, stepping into homes already filled with children not their own. But not every marriage was a prison. Some couples built strong partnerships, their shared struggles forging bonds of loyalty. Letters and diaries reveal tender moments, a husband sewing while his wife healed from childbirth, or a wife nursing her partner through fever. Yet, these moments of tenderness were overshadowed by the sheer weight of survival, reminding women daily that marriage was a gamble, and often, the odds were not in their favor. Prostitution and the so-called soiled doves. For many women, the brutal truth was that the only way to earn money quickly was through sex work. In frontier towns, prostitution flourished alongside saloons, gambling halls, and dance halls. Women known as soiled doves often worked in cramped, filthy rooms, enduring drunk customers, violence, and the ever-present threat of disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread unchecked, and without antibiotics, they were slow, torturous killers. Despite this, sex workers filled a crucial economic niche. They provided companionship to men who had left their families behind and became central figures in towns where women were scarce. Some even managed to rise in wealth and status, running brothels that doubled as boarding houses and entertainment venues. Yet, society judged them harshly. Respectable women shunned them, churches condemned them, and the law often treated them as criminals. Their children, if they had any, bore the stigma of their mother's profession. For every success story, there were dozens more of women beaten, abandoned, or dead before 30. It was a brutal reality. Many women turned to prostitution not out of choice, but out of desperation. And though they helped build the very towns that scorned them, they remained outsiders in the history of the West. Medicine and quack cures for women. Illness was an inevitable part of frontier life, and for women, medical care was shockingly inadequate. Doctors were few, and many had little formal training. For women, this often meant enduring outdated treatments, bloodletting, opium-laced tinctures or mercury-based medicines that caused more harm than good. Women's specific health issues were barely understood. Menstruation was treated as an illness, menopause as madness, and postpartum depression as hysteria. Remedies included rest cures that confined women to bed for weeks, or bizarre tonics promising to restore female vitality. When professional help failed, women turned to folk medicine. Herbal remedies, midwives, and indigenous healers offered cures passed down through generations. Some worked, like willow bark for pain relief, while others were dangerous. The scarcity of medicine forced women to improvise. They boiled willow tea for fevers, chewed tobacco for toothaches, and used lard mixed with herbs as poultices. In desperate cases, surgery was performed at home with kitchen knives, whiskey as anesthesia, and the prayers of neighbors as the only comfort. For women of the frontier, sickness was not just a personal burden but a constant reminder of how fragile life really was. The burden of widowhood. Widowhood was common in the Wild West, and it often turned a woman's world upside down overnight. Husbands died from gunfights, accidents, disease, or simply the grinding labor of frontier life. When that happened, their widows were left to pick up the pieces. Property laws often worked against women, with land and assets reverting to male relatives instead of staying with the widow. Widows with children faced an impossible choice: remarry quickly to secure support, or try to survive alone in a world that offered few opportunities. Many remarried within months, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes gladly if the new husband promised stability. Others refused marriage altogether, carving out independent lives as innkeepers, laundresses, or scooty chairs. These women were admired for their grit, but also faced scorn for stepping outside traditional roles. They were called unwomanly, or unmarriageable, reminders that the frontier punished women who defied expectations. And yet, some widows thrived. Freed from the authority of husbands, they discovered a rare taste of autonomy. They managed businesses, claimed land under their own names, and became powerful figures in their communities. Widowhood, though often tragic, sometimes offered the very independence marriage had denied them: faith, churches, and the weight of morality. Religion was both a refuge and a burden for frontier women. Churches were among the first institutions established in new towns, and women often formed their backbone. They organized gatherings, taught children, and raised money for construction and upkeep. Faith gave women community, purpose, and the promise of salvation beyond their hard lives. But with religion came morality, and for women, morality was often a cage. Churches demanded strict behavior, modest dress, and unquestioned obedience to male authority. A woman who strayed from these expectations, whether through divorce, prostitution, or even outspoken independence, faced condemnation. Despite this, women wielded quiet power within churches. They ran charities, cared for the sick, and sometimes used religious influence to demand reforms. From temperance movements to better schools, faith became a double-edged sword. It bound women under strict codes, yet it also gave them the tools to reshape their world, one prayer meeting at a time. Violence, fear, and the law that didn't protect. The Wild West is often remembered for its lawlessness: gunfights in dusty streets, saloons filled with tension. But for women, violence was far more personal. Domestic abuse was common, and the law rarely intervened. Sheriffs and judges often turned a blind eye, dismissing it as a private matter. Women who spoke out risked being ostracized or disbelieved. Even when cases went to trial, juries of all men were reluctant to convict husbands. Outside the home, women faced other dangers. Stagecoach travel risked bandit attacks, and isolated cabins invited raids. A woman alone on the frontier was vulnerable, and even in town, drunken aggression from men in saloons and gambling halls could escalate quickly. Some women fought back. Diaries tell of wives sleeping with pistols under their pillows, mothers teaching daughters to shoot, and saloon girls stabbing abusive customers with hidden knives. But resistance carried its own risks: retaliation, scandal, or imprisonment. In the end, the Wild West's lack of legal protection left women exposed, forcing them to rely on themselves, their wits, and sometimes the sheer power of reputation to survive. The myth versus the reality. Hollywood has painted the Wild West as a place of freedom and adventure, where rugged men tamed the frontier and women stood loyally by their side. But the reality was far harsher, especially for women. The myth of the pioneer wife as a cheerful, hard-working partner glosses over the brutal daily grind, endless pregnancies, and lack of medical care. The glamorous image of the saloon girl hides the darker truth of exploitation, disease, and violence. Even the supposedly independent ranch women, celebrated for their toughness, lived under constant pressure to conform to society's rules. Yet the myth persists because it comforts us. It turns suffering into romance, erases exploitation, and makes the Wild West seem like a story of triumph rather than survival. But behind every legendary outlaw, every cattle baron, and every pioneer hero, there were countless women whose struggles and sacrifices made that history possible, and their reality, stripped of the Hollywood gloss, was a world most of us today would not survive. Resilience and the hidden legacy of women. For all the hardship, pain, and brutality, women of the Wild West left behind something remarkable: resilience. They raised children in impossible conditions, built homes out of sod and wood, endured hunger and cold, and still found time to create community through schools, churches, and charities. Many became midwives, teachers, healers, and business owners, carving out roles that gave them influence in towns that barely acknowledged their worth. Their legacy is often hidden, overshadowed by gunslingers and cowboys, but it lingers in the very towns they helped build. Women's letters, diaries, and oral histories preserve stories of grit, tenderness, and courage. Their strength turned wilderness into civilization, even as they bore the brunt of its hardships. The truth is, without women, the Wild West would not have been tamed. And though history often forgets them, their resilience continues to echo, in the ghost towns, in the broken trails, and in the descendants who carry their blood today. Life for women in the Wild West was not a romantic adventure. It was a daily battle against poverty, violence, disease, and a society that often refused to value them. They were the silent backbone of the frontier, and their struggles remind us how brutal survival could truly be. If you found this journey through history eye-opening, don't let it end here. There are countless hidden stories of suffering, resilience, and forgotten voices, waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe for more deep, immersive explorations of the past. Leave a comment. Which part of frontier women's lives shocked you the most? And if you enjoyed this, give it a like. It helps bring more untold histories to light, because sometimes, the past isn't about glory or legend, it's about survival.